For the fourth and final part of this lecture, we will be talking about some ethical issues in social psychology. Now, it's worth noting here that this brief section will not go into the full depth of all the various ethical issues pertaining to psychology in general, but even science as a whole, and I do highly recommend looking into it if going into research is something you are interested in. Now, there is a fundamental contradiction in doing experiments. For scientific reasons, high external validity, researchers want their experiments to resemble the real world as much as possible, along with experiments being highly controlled, which is high internal validity. At the same time, they also want to, or at least they should want to, avoid causing participants any kind of stress or discomfort, unpleasantness, or harm. Now, unfortunately, this has not always been the case. Not saying that there was a time where all people tried to cause harm, but over the years there have been all kinds of different types of experimenters, some who don't care as much as others about the well-being of their participants. Oftentimes these two goals can be at odds with one another. Think back to when we were talking about the experiment in which someone had a seizure even though it was faked. You can imagine that this would cause a lot of stress and discomfort for participants, even when they had to face directly the fact that they did not get up and go help, even though that is generally the normative thing one would do. Hence, you are causing a great deal of discomfort to your participants. Now, one of the ways to get around this at least, or at least to address it, is to use informed consent. And informed consent refers to the agreement to participate in an experiment, which is granted in full awareness of the nature of the experiment. That means that the experiment is explained to the participant before the participant takes part in the study, which is the has been explained in advance part. Now, this generally allows us to mitigate the dilemma between conducting certain types of research and causing harm to participants. This is because if a participant knows what is to come and the potential for either harm or stress, and they are willingly admitting or wanting to continue in the experiment, it is no longer you who are subjecting them to it, but rather their willing participants, right? Get consent. It's true across all domains of life, in my opinion. An example of this is something called the cold pressor task, which is oftentimes used to study pain tolerance. In fact, one of my peers at this university had done a study to look at how playing different types of music or listening to music impacts our ability to withstand painful events. And the painful event was this cold pressor task, which ultimately requires that you place your hand in a bucket of ice water and leave it for as long as you can. Now, any of you who know what it's like to have your hands in something very cold for an extended period of time know that after a period of cold, you begin to feel pain, and it is very uncomfortable. Now, while it in the times that one is conducting the experiment is unlikely to cause any type of permanent damage, it does cause stress and harm, and therefore it is mandated that you tell a participant beforehand what type of task they will be going through. Now, there are some caveats to informed consent. One is that the participant must be of sound mind. This means that informed consent, even if they sign on the form, does not count if they have some form of, let's say, mental handicap or they are intoxicated. If you are conducting a study and a young college student comes in and they are wasted out of their mind, even relatively inebriated for that matter, they are not eligible to give informed consent because they are not of sound mind, right? You can just see it with alcohol all the time. We are more likely to take risks that we would not take otherwise when we are under the influence. Further, special care must be taken with protected populations. What we mean by this is people like children, for example. Children are oftentimes not considered to be able to give informed consent because they're generally, even though some are, many could be said to not understand the full ramifications of taking part in an experiment. This is especially true of young children. Another form of protected populations would be prisoners, for example, where the fear of retribution by guards, for example, for not taking part in a study could force them to consent even if they did not want to. If there is some external pressure being applied that is being used to obtain or garner consent, that is not actually consent, and in those cases, informed consent does not apply. Some studies require the use of deception, and these are oftentimes or are cases where informing the participant about the true goals of a study would contaminate or bias their responses. And whenever this is the case, deception is used. And deception is the misleading of participants about the true purpose of a study or the events that will actually transpire. Now, it is important to note that deception is only appropriate when there are no other means to obtain quality data, not just because the experimenter feels like deceiving a bunch of participants. That is not a good enough reason to use deception in a study. Whenever deceptions have been used, the use of debriefings after the experiment is mandatory. That being said, it is just a good practice in general to use debriefings at the end of all experiments. A debriefing is explaining to participants at the end of the experiment the true purpose of the study and exactly what transpired, and oftentimes will include what the experimenter hoped to find, along with contact information if the participant would like to learn more about the study at some later date. Another part of a debriefing that is also used commonly, though not as widespread as just a pure debriefing, is something called a funneled debriefing. And this is a series of questions given to the participant at the end of a study immediately prior to the actual debriefing. And these questions allow the experimenter to probe whether the participant had any idea of what the true purpose of that study was. It gives us a clue as to whether they were modifying their responses based on what they expected the participant or the experimenter to want. This is called experimental demand. Or if there was anything that interfered with their performance. For example, in a cognitive performance task, if someone is just utterly starving and they can't, not like real starving, but just they're really hungry because they haven't eaten breakfast or lunch that day, that they will be horribly distracted by the pangs of hunger, and this could impair their performance and actually not have anything to do with slower cognitive performance. These are just two different forms, and oftentimes, as mentioned, it is good practice to include them after the end of any type of experiment. On most university campuses that do research, there's something called an Institutional Review Board, or shortened to IRB, as you will hear most people refer to it. And any institution that seeks federal funding for psychological research is required to have an IRB. Now, an IRB is a group made up of at least one scientist, one non-scientist, and one member not affiliated with the institution. So, for example, a community member. And their job is to review all psychological research at that institution and decide whether it meets ethical guidelines or not. Now, it is important to note that all research must be approved by an IRB before it is conducted. You cannot do an experiment, find some cool results, and then submit an IRB. That is considered bad practice. Also, just please note that some of the research that will be presented in this text, a lot of it predating the 1970s, was conducted before the mandated use of IRBs. There are certain things in our history of research, both in psychology and in medicine, that raised a lot of concerns about how participants were being treated, which began to change how we approach these situations and mandated the use of ethical guidelines. We will talk about a few of those guidelines now. The first set of these selected guidelines, first of all, psychologists seek, and scientists in general, to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in science, teaching, and the practice of psychology. This is very important because one can easily imagine how problematic it could be if science was used for nefarious purposes. In fact, there are many historical examples of this. One that many don't really think about is the studies of hysteria. Hysteria derives from this concept that strange and wild behaviors arrive because of a woman's uterus. And they use this ultimately to prove, quote unquote, that they were not as fit for certain types of work or jobs as men were. And this was approached under the guise of science, but in many ways, this was just a way to reinforce conventional patriarchal norms. If science begins to have an agenda and it tries to promote things based on its own wishes, it has lost one of the core pieces of ethical guidelines that have been established for the practice of science. It is very important to maintain this accuracy, this honesty, and truthfulness. Further, psychologists are to respect the dignity and worth of all people and the rights of individuals to their privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. This means that at any point in time, if people wish to no longer take part in it, they are more than welcome to do so. If at any point they feel it is in violation of their personally held beliefs, they are free to leave without any reprisal from the psychologist. Further, they are not able to treat some participants in some ways and not others. For example, you could not pay one group of people more than you paid another group based on your preconceived notions about the worth of those groups. This is not an ethical way to conduct research. Further, psychologists have a primary obligation to take reasonable precautions to protect confidential information obtained through and stored on any medium. This means that you keep your data on encrypted hard drives and in locked laboratories. You do not just pass it around on a thumb drive that could be stolen at a coffee shop. These days, there are an unbelievable amount of examples that show the misuse of data and how it can be used for all kinds of nefarious purposes. Identity fraud is just one of these. Now, research data is often far more sensitive and personal than the random things that can be collected on the day-to-day sort of phishing operations one finds across the internet. And so publicizing that type of data could cause a lot of problems for a lot of people. For example, in a lot of cases in work, even though our personal sexual activities are private, sometimes when they are brought to bear, we could face discrimination in the workplace if our entire cohort knew what things we were into. Now, that example might not hit for everybody, but the truth is almost all of us have things we would rather keep private. And there are probably researchers who want to study those types of things. If that data got out there, it could cause a tremendous amount of harm for our participants. Thus, it is our obligation to keep that information confidential and anonymous to the possibility that we can. Continuing on, whenever we conduct research, whether it's in person or via electronic transmission, so surveys over the internet or other forms of communication like a phone interview, obtaining informed consent is vital. It must be done. When it comes to obtaining informed consent, there are several components that need to be included. One, the purpose of the research, its expected duration, and the procedures involved should be told to the participant so long as no deception is involved, in which case a debriefing is required. But in all cases where there is no deception, one must inform the participant about that purpose, the duration, and procedures. It is also the right of the participant, and they must be made aware of this, to withdraw from research at any time, whether it is right after signing the consent form or whether it is 1 minute before the end of the experiment. It does not matter. At any moment in time, they are free to withdraw whenever they choose. Further, the foreseeable consequences of declining or withdrawing must be stated. Now, for the most part, there are no real consequences for them other than a loss of data and time for the experimenter, and that should be stated. They cannot ethically be penalized. For example, if I was having you take part in studies that I'm doing at San Francisco State, I could not tell you that if you don't finish, you will fail the class. That is unethical, and I could be sued over that. Next, any foreseeable factors that could influence their willingness to participate, for example, you will have to suffer through putting your hand in very cold water multiple times, need to be told to the participants before they start the experiment. Thus, they are making an informed decision about any potential risks they will go through. If you do not tell them, you are not informing them. Further, any prospective research benefits, this oftentimes refers to any long-term benefits that could arrive if the research proves favorable. They need to be told about this. So, for example, if they are in a condition where they are receiving a placebo treatment and it is found that some new psychological therapy works unbelievably well at reducing symptoms of PTSD, for example, that those who are in the placebo condition who did not actually receive the treatment are able to then go and receive that treatment. The provision of that treatment is required by the researchers when they are setting up studies. This is also true of medical services. Further, the limits of confidentiality. This is a statement saying that there is always the possibility that their data could be stolen. but you will also inform them of all the various things that you would do to ensure that that is not the case. As I mentioned previously, locked laboratories and encrypted hard drives are the bare minimum. Incentives for participation. This is oftentimes whether they will be paid or they will get credit. You have to tell them beforehand what they will receive. And finally, they must be told whom they can contact about their rights as a participant. Finally, psychologists cannot just willy-nilly conduct studies involving deception. It must be determined that there is some justifiable reason, so contribution to science or through education or some kind of applied value, and that there is no other non-deceptive way in which to obtain the information. Only then can a psychologist use deception in a study, or rather a study using deception. Whenever deception is used, psychologists must explain the deception to a participant as soon as they can without destroying or disrupting the actual experiment. Finally, psychologists must provide the opportunity for participants to obtain appropriate information about the nature, results, and conclusions of the research. This is ultimately the debriefing. And they have to take reasonable steps to correct any misconceptions that the participants might have. So you cannot just let them go on believing things that they now believe because of this deception without correcting them to the extent that that is possible. This is also something that is oftentimes done in a debriefing.